In July 2013, a massive train derailment in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec killed 47 and destroyed the heart of that town. The disaster cast a harsh light on rail safety in Canada. Crude oil is transported across our country and continent every single day, through small towns, through big cities. Our next guest says there are quite obviously significant safety concerns to consider. In our nation's capital, here's Emile Therien. He is past president of the Canada Safety Council. And Emile, it's good to have you back here on TVO. How's it going?
It's great to be back, Steve. How are you doing?
Just great, thank you very much. I want to read just a sort of a snapshot of a few of the recommendations from this joint report from the American and Canadian Transportation Safety Boards about rail safety, and then get you to react to them. Here's what they, in essence, talk about. Tougher standards for all existing and new Class 111 tank cars. They talk about strategic route planning and safer train operations. They talk about emergency response assistance plans to be created along routes. As a general package, what do you think of whether they're on the right or wrong track with all of that?
Because the Transportation Safety Board came up with those recommendations after a very intensive investigation, you got to believe, because they're a very, very credible organization. I think the first about tank cars is a bit of a stretch. They've not established any timeline for that, and I'm very skeptical that we could do this in the short run. I think we're looking at a long time into the future before we ever, every tank car carrying crude oil in North America will be really compliant with the new standard. It's just not going to happen.
Well, let's go through these and get into some more detail on each one. Class 111 tank cars. First of all, what is a Class 111 tank car?
Well, it's really, this standard goes back, you know, this is something not from yesterday, it goes back about 10 or 15 years. It's just built to a more solid standard than the large majority of cars that are now transporting oil in North America. So there's no question about it. The standards set for these, they go into extreme detail. The manufacturers, the railroads and governments are all involved. So I would assume, and I would say it's a very, very tough standard.
Do they need to be tougher?
I don't know, Steve. Time will tell. I would think what now, with what's come out of Lac-Mégantic, Plaster Rock, and a couple incidents in the United States, that they must be very, very, very tough. Otherwise, we'll have more problems.
The DOT 111s, critics say they are precarious. What's your view on it?
Well, they probably are, but let's put this in the perspective of what happened. We had 4 incidents where these, the stability of these cars came into question. There seems to be no other incidents where their reliability was questioned. So, do 4 incidents, constitute or should have constituted a major concern among Canadians, among consumers, the railways, and also the people who really own these cars. You got to realize the railways do not own these cars. They're owned by the leasing companies and customers. And
that distinction is important because why?
Well, I think I'm not saying that it leaves the railways off the hook because they don't own them, but they will have to force these manufacturers to comply with the new standard. It'll be a condition of buying. If you don't comply with the standard, we will be prohibited by law in Canada and the United States from purchasing your product.
Okay, let's look at another recommendation. Strategic route planning and safer train operations. What do you infer from that?
Well, I think there's a lot of good in that, but where are the new strategic routes going to be? Years ago, I know Ottawa, I think Toronto tried it, all our major cities. We did reroute rail lines far from the downtown core of the cities. But if you look where these are now, they're part of the suburbs. And if you look at the recent major accident here involving OC Transpo and Via Rail, 20 years ago, Barrhaven was out in the boondocks. No longer, it's part of our city now, and the rail line runs through there.
So the reality is it's pretty tough to keep building these rail lines further away from populated areas because the population catches up.
Well, you're absolutely right. Look at you go north in Toronto. You have communities as far as Peterborough. There's no question about that.
Right.
Yeah, you're right.
Another one, emergency response assistance plans along routes. That seems to make pretty common sense, doesn't it?
It makes a lot of sense because ERAPs, we know them, have been around for a long time. And now if you designate oil as a dangerous product, you would need what we call an ERAP. There's no question about it. It makes a lot of sense. And there should be no resistance from anybody on that particular recommendation.
Well, the question then becomes, if any of this had been in place before July of 2013, would Lac-Mégantic have had a different conclusion?
You know, my answer to that be, yeah, most likely. There's no question about it. There would have been probably a heck of a lot less damage. But you look at Lac-Mégantic, Steve, one of this, you know, as bad as that was, you know, the loss of lives, the destruction of just a beautiful little community, you know, there was a refinery not far away, and a lot of the foam that was used to extinguish the fire at Lac-Mégantic came from that. So they had that added benefit, as bad as that incident was. And that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen in every part of Canada. There's not a refinery, you know, in every community.
Sure. The report seems to focus a great deal, obviously, on the rails, on the cars, not so much on the safety of crude oil itself. Do you think they were missing something by not looking at that?
Well, I think they will in time. I think the American government is, and certainly we will be looking at that. But you got to realize we've been transporting oil by rail for a heck of a long time, at least 5 years. 5 years ago, I think you had 500 tank cars of oil, you know, in Canada. Now we're into thousands and thousands and thousands. So if you put that in perspective, and I'm not, you know, we've had very, very few incidents. 99.99% of oil shipped by rail gets to its destination safely.
Well, of course, it's that 0.001% that has the potential to cause enormous chaos. Yeah, let's take a look at some.
Concern.
Sure. I mean, I'm going to. Since you brought up some numbers, I want to add some numbers to the record here, because some of these are quite interesting, and I suspect people don't know about them. Canada's rail network is the third largest in the whole world. It is the fourth largest in volume of goods transported. It transports 70% of Canada's surface goods and 40% of Canada's exports. It also carries about 70 million people annually. Yeah. And just to amplify on the numbers that you just gave us a moment ago, in 2009, 500 carloads of crude shipped by rail in Canada, just 500. Half a decade later, it's 160,000 carloads of crude. Yeah. Just an exponentially huge increase. And the question, of course, becomes, and growing. And the question, of course, becomes, you know, one could argue that our infrastructure was not designed to handle 160,000. It may have been built for 500. So is it reasonable to ask the question whether the current infrastructure can handle such an increase?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, I think time will tell that, because of the volumes of oil that are shipped by rail are going to increase significantly. There's no question about it. I think overall, if you look at Transport Canada as a regulator, I think over time they've done a very, very, very good job, and they continue to do a good job. What I think they may need to make sure that infrastructure is properly maintained and updated, I think they need more resources, financial, human, and otherwise. There's no question about that.
Generally speaking, where is the oil being shipped from and to?
Well, it's coming from the Bakken region of North Dakota. You got to realize most people think the Bakken area is really relatively new in the last few years. It does not. It goes back 55 years, believe it or not. They started taking oil out of the ground there. And the first modes of shipment for Bakken oil were by truck transport for years and years and years. And then they realized the government, North Dakota and surrounding provinces and states said, hey, this is not a way to do it. You're destroying our roads. You know, the number of spills is just unbelievable. So we got to find an alternative way. So they went to rail. Huh. And rails took advantage of it because it's a tremendous economic opportunity. It's unbelievable how well the railroads are doing out of this.
Well, let me ask you about yet another alternative. And obviously you've been following with interest, I'm sure, the Keystone XL and the Northern Gateway pipeline issues. Yeah. And I wonder whether you think those two pipelines represent a potential alternative which might alleviate the pressure to transport oil on the rail system.
No, I think the pressure is to transport oil by whether Keystone and the other pipeline go ahead or not. I think, I would like to see them go. That's my personal belief. But I think we're going to still see large shipments of oil being transported by rail. There's no question about it. You look at the markets, where not only in North America, but around the world, we're going to sell our oil to China. We're going to sell our oil here. It's all over, Steve. So we will need the capacity to get that oil to port and then to market.
So anybody who wants to say we need these pipelines because it will help alleviate the pressure on the rail system, that's not a good argument in your view?
No, not in my view, and I've heard other people share my opinion on that. Others disagree with me.
Okay. One of the interesting things about this report is that it wasn't out of the U.S. or Canada. It was actually out of the U.S. and Canada. It was a joint report. Yeah. And I wonder whether you think that means that both countries will be equally as committed to implementing whatever recommendations came out of it.
Oh, I fully agree, Steve. If you look at the tank car issue, I should tell you that there's only 4 manufacturers in North America, and one is in Hamilton, National Steel Car, and it presents a tremendous economic opportunity to build these new cars or even retrofit them. So I think there's a common interest, a common economic interest, and there's also a common safety concern across this continent. Don't forget, there was a crude oil shipment with oil from the Bakken at a serious incident in Alabama a few months ago, and even in the small town near the Bakken fields, a couple of weeks ago, there was another derailment, which was caused. Luckily, nobody was killed, but there was an incident. So the Americans, are having their terrible incidents with the Bakken oil too. There's no question about it.
Well, we're not necessarily talking cars here. We may be talking rails as well. Are you equally as satisfied with the safety of the rails as you apparently are about the cars?
Well, if you look, I was a severe critic of the rail industry going back years, both as a private citizen and my job with the President of Canada Safety Council. Up to 2007, the rail safety in this country was just terrible, to the point where the Minister of Transport, Lawrence Cannon, one day in the House of Commons said rail safety in this country has gone down the tubes. Since then, we've had a remarkable turnaround in safety. The record is getting very, very good, but these incidents, Lac-Mégantic and Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, bring that safety record into question. There's absolutely no question about that. Okay,
let me take you back, though, over those few years, from the time Lawrence Cannon made those comments. To what do you attribute the fact that we apparently have made significant improvements in safety since then?
Well, I think the railroads, and 2 main ones, why would they want derailments? There were 102 main track derailments in this country, over a 10-year period. That's a heck of a... Why would you want that, as a company? Why would you want, your trains going off the tracks and causing you millions and millions of dollars every year? So I think there was an awareness, there was an economic awareness. Let's clean up our act. And I think Transport Canada got quite involved. They were, new laws were passed, and Transport Canada was given more money to really beef up its regulatory authority. I think that's taken hold, and there's no question about it. And I think what's happening in the railroad industry, there's a safety of culture that's coming back. And I think that means a lot. And I think there's a greater awareness that, historically, labor management relations in the rail industry were not all that good or cordial, but I think they're now healing, and they're coming together to realize, that we're in this game together, and I think that means a lot. And that this culture of safety, is very, very important, not only in the rail industry, but in any industry.
Okay, I think I know.
It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
No, I hear you, but I think I know your answer to this, but I'm going to put it to you anyway, because here's a quote from a website, rabble.ca. Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued his own reassuring statement about rail safety the day following the Plaster Rock accident. He said, quote, "Canadians should not be mistaken. The rate of railway accidents in Canada is very low. We have made significant investments in rail safety and rail inspections." Do you agree with the PM?
I think to a large degree I do. I think the government has put their best foot forward, in terms of, sourcing Transport Canada with the needed resources to do the job, and also to convince the railway companies, hey, you got to improve your record. Nobody gains with a terrible record like you had.
So do you think the railway companies' responses have been adequate to the challenge?
I think, have they been 100%? I would say maybe they're 70 or 80%, but I think they got the message. And I think their shareholders have also got the message, hey, you got to improve because it's costing us money.
Well, one of the other players in this, of course, is the National Transportation Safety Board here in Canada. Yeah. Do you think they bear any responsibility with regard to any of the derailments that we have recently seen?
Oh, I would not think so, Steve. And I could make a point on that. It's okay to have regulations and all kinds of laws, but if they're not enforced, you have a problem. Many laws are on the books, and about 90% of them are never enforced. And I think maybe this should be re-examined. If you have regulations or whatnot in the rail industry, we got to make sure they're enforced, they're complied with, and this is the role of Transport Canada. And historically, it's done that job extremely well.
You still have confidence in the rail system of this country, is that right?
Well, if we don't have confidence, and if it's not perfect, we got to at least strive for perfection. It's huge, as you mentioned earlier. Remember, the amount of good in business it does in this country is phenomenal, far greater than any other industries. There's absolutely no question about it. And it's no longer only Canada. Our two main railroads run north-south, east-west, so they're integrated in its continent. And eventually, I understand now they're also running into Mexico. As part of that NAFTA deal. So, they are good players in the economy. Historically, they've been very great economic producers. They still are, but I think they have incidents they got to get on board and they got to get rid of. And safety's got to become the paramount objective with them, because another Lac-Mégantic or Plaster Rock, and I don't know where that would take us or the railroads. There's major issues, and they should address them now. And Transport Canada should take the lead in really helping them address those issues.
Emile Therien, past president, Canada Safety Council. It's always good of you to join us on TVO. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Steve. Anytime.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.